Welcome to the Corporate Venturing Insider Series, where I interview top practitioners in the CVC world and learn with you the best practices and golden nuggets that they have accumulated over their career. In this episode, we will be learning from Nicole LeBlanc, a partner at Woven Capital. Nicole, welcome.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So Nicole, maybe you could start a little bit sharing about your background and how you got into corporate venturing.
Perfect. I did not take a linear path to get into venture capital. I am from a very small town in Atlantic Canada of 1,000 people. And so growing up, this was not even a career I would have aspired to even understanding existed. And so it's really great to have ended up here, and it's really exciting. When I started my career, I was an accountant. So I did really great in mathematics and these black and white courses, but it was really great getting that strong base of accounting and finance early in my career. And one of the things I used to do was these product costing. So I'd go down on the factory floor and ask about run rates of machines and talk to the people actually doing the work, which was really great. And for personal reasons, my husband and I moved physical locations, and so I had to get a new job. And so I was interviewing at different places, and I accidentally fell into venture, as a lot of people did at that point in time. So I've been in venture about 15 years. And I would say in my venture career, I've had 3 chapters. And so there was that early venture activity where it was mainly in Canada, mainly at the seed stage. And it was meeting lots of companies and really getting to understand the industry. So it was a really fun chapter of my life. And it was mainly focused on early stage seed investing. And so the economics and the models kind of followed that path. And then I really ran into CVC after that. And so I led venture capital for the Sidewalk Labs project, which was an Alphabet and Google project in Toronto, really wanting to think about smart and sustainable cities. And so it was really great being able to just walk down the hall and talk to an expert in mass timber and buildings. And so I could really build a really interesting thesis around how to support prop tech and construction tech and like what the key levers were from a customer perspective. And so really enjoyed that part of my career and have continued on in my role here at Woven with a lot of the work that we're doing around kind of like mobility and cities and energy and how all of those things tie together. My career has kind of had those 3 chapters where it was the pure finance role, then the early seed kind of investment role, and now more of the proper CVC and really thinking about like, how do you help a parent company think about innovation and new product development?
So my next question was accounting. So what do you use that relates to your background in accounting?
There's a couple of things. There's the very obvious things about understanding how finance works and understanding financial statements and being able to quickly review all of the financial statements. A couple of tips for people in the audience: always read the balance sheet and always read the notes. So if there's something uncertain or maybe unusual, those are always in the notes. So those are interesting to read. Don't take it for granted that other investors or other people have done the due diligence. A funny example is I was doing due diligence on a company in my past, and I was reading the financial statements, and they have first year and then previous year. And there was a line item called airplane. And I decided to ask the other investors who had already participated in the first close what the background on that was. And they had failed to notice that there was a line item on the balance sheet for an early stage startup called airplane, which is highly unusual. So I asked the CEO, very good explanation. They were located in an area that wasn't close to a major hub. They had an industrial product. They had to ship big pieces of equipment around. It was secondhand. It paid for itself in 6 months. So the explanation was fine, but it's just unusual that nobody else as part of the syndicate had noticed. And so I think some of those things is that I gravitate towards the financial elements. And so they're the first things that I look at. So it's very helpful when structuring and planning your due diligence process. The second element is because I was an accountant, it speaks to my structured personality. And so it really helps me with organization. I'm an inbox zero kind of person. And I have spreadsheets for everything. I have checklists for everything. And so it really helps as part of the due diligence process or a portfolio management process to be able to incorporate those things in my day-to-day routines.
So I also want to ask about Canada. You come from Canada. How do you see the venture capital environment in Canada, maybe historically, but also recently?
So there's two key elements to what's going on in Canada that I think are actually indicative of some other jurisdictions. And now that I live in Japan, seeing the activity that's going on here, it's quite similar. So there's three key players in any sort of tech scene or tech startup scene. There's the private sector VC funds, there's the corporate VC funds, and there's the government. And so you really need at least two of three really doubling down. And so in Canada, there wasn't actually a lot of activities from the corporates. If you look at the kind of the economy of Canada, it's a lot of commodity or like natural resources, old family run companies, things like that, that are quite conservative. And venture capital just wasn't an area that over the years they were very active in. So the other two players were government and the private sector. And the role that the government played was through a sovereign wealth fund for the most part, providing the ability to spur private sector investment to focus on how to get the tech sector more robust with a very, aggressive kind of neighbor to the south that technically on average was about 10x any market size. And companies wanted to go to the US. How do you sort of, make sure that the Canadian ecosystem takes advantage of that proximity, but doesn't suffer a brain drain or having all the companies move? And so in Canada, the government really plays a key role. And early in my career, it was more about just spurring any investment, so much more generalist. And now it's becoming much more focused. At first, it was generalist funds, just trying to get out there. Now it's about having a strong fund of funds element, and also now getting into women-led funds, Indigenous-led funds, deep tech funds. So really trying to think about how do you spur in these really subsectors to de-risk the market, and then to get the private sector to come in and hopefully be able to run with it in the long term.
I like the way you're describing the latest trend is really about professionalization and much more granular. Maybe we can talk about fund of fund, and clearly this is something you have experienced, but why do you think it matters for Canada to have more of this fund of fund approach?
So this is something that at Woven we also think about is what is the value of fund of funds? And so fund of funds really help get sector and geographic coverage for a group like us. And in Canada, it's really about spurring private development, and why they're supporting this. It then spurs people to think about creativity. And that's what you want. You want the private sector to lead with the government trying to amplify and de-risk some of that. And then over time, so right now, some of the government funds, some of the fund of funds have 50, 60, 80% government LPs, but then over time, by the time they get to fund 3 or 4, that's significantly lower. And so it really can help spur that private sector element, which is what a lot of economies are looking for, is how do you get the private sector dollars to flow?
And now I want to lead on to Woven Capital, because I was lucky enough that you shared with me one of your very thoughtful process about fund to fund. And you're probably one of the most advanced in terms of thinking about fund to fund strategically and tactically. Maybe first at high level, why do you think a CVC will benefit? And of course, you touched about sector specific and so on, but the first thing that the board of directors will say is, why do you want to do fund to fund? So how would you answer that to a BOD?
It gives us sector and geographic coverage. Our team, most of us are based here in Tokyo. We do have some on the west coast of the US. However, we can't cover everything. And as a global OEM, we need to know what's going on in global markets. And so I can go to the UK, or I can go to Africa, or I can go to New York, but I'm not embedded there, and I don't really know the details of what's going on. I'm not embedded in the ecosystem. So by having a fund-to-fund strategy, it gives us deal flow and market insights that we would have to have a big team to do. And so it's just a more efficient way of us to get that insight. And then it's also not about just our one investment in that LP. It's about who are the other LPs. We're able to then network and make industry connections and share insights and learn from some of the other LPs when we go to some of these annual meetings or workshops that they have.
So it's about access, including access of talent.
Yes, exactly.
Very nice. But I think it's not just effective, it's also cost efficient. I mean, you could build a team in many geographies, but that would just be so expensive compared to very quickly get it. And you could argue, hopefully, if you choose well your fund, it doesn't cost you anything because it could actually return financial gain.
And some of the expertise and some of the fund of funds that we've invested in, we couldn't afford them, or they just wouldn't want to come work for us. We wouldn't be able to get the insights because of who they are and the networks and the role that they play. It's not like we could actually hire them even if we wanted to. The insights that we're getting are because of the fact that they are an independent fund, or they maybe are still tied to academia or some very key industry.
Now, your fund is $800 million AUM.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably extremely attractive when you knock the door on a fund. They reply and they want to treat you with a red carpet. How do you select the funds? Because even if it's geo-based, you still have so many choices. You need to be very thorough and pick which ones you think will bring the best value. How do you go through the selection process?
So again, more checklists. And so what was important is we aligned it to our investment thesis. So just like you would build an investment thesis for your direct investments, we wanted to mirror that for our indirect investments in our fund of funds. And so where are the gaps? Where are the opportunities that we as a team can't cover or need access to? And so then we went hunting for funds that could do that. They don't want to back an emerging manager. They only want tried and true and tested, because they're entirely focused on financial returns. And financials are very important to us, because if the company or the fund isn't going to be able to provide a financial return, like they don't have longevity, which then can't give us the strategic returns. And so really looking for those experts that could really help us execute against our thesis. And so we ended up deciding to allocate a specific percentage of our fund size to fund of funds, investing early in our fund cycle in those funds. And obviously mobility and the future of mobility was the key. But we also wanted to think about what is adjacent to our core thesis, because we're not going to hire people to manage that internally because it's not core to our thesis, but it's still really important for us to understand trends in AI, trends in cybersecurity, those types of areas. And so basically that's what we've been able to build with our fund of funds portfolio.
Okay, so this is a golden nugget, which is using fund of fund not just for access to talent in different geographies and insights, but also where it would be very hard to justify recruiting for yourself.
Yes.
Like cybersecurity, very hard to justify recruiting when you work in mobility.
Yes.
But you need to know the impact of cybersecurity to Toyota.
And in industries like all of the OEMs, we're all transitioning from car companies to mobility companies. And technology just, it is moving so fast now that although cybersecurity is a staple and everybody needs to have it, it's not necessarily a key investment theme for us. But because of a breakthrough, like a ChatGPT, all of a sudden it could become a really important core element to our thesis. So we need to be able to monitor that over time, because in 5 or 10 years, that might end up moving over and becoming core to us. We don't know. And so if we're not monitoring it, then we can't make those decisions.
Very nice. So let's talk also about your experience working for a VC with many LPs to now working for a corporate VC with one LP. What's the biggest change, and what do you like the most, and what were you surprised about?
There's pros and cons to each. And so I would say why I've ended up here is that example I used earlier about being able to walk down the hall and knock on somebody's door that's an expert. And so I say in venture capital, particularly people with a finance background like myself, I know just enough to be dangerous. So I know a little bit about a lot of things. I need to know enough to ask the right questions, but I don't have the time to be able to go deep in hydrogen and battery development and charging and robotics for factories. There's just too many things. I'd spend all my time learning. And so I love it that I actually have internal experts that are working on this on a daily basis, and I can kind of get access to how they're thinking about it through that. And it helps me validate a company faster. So if a company reaches out in that space, then I can just reach out to them and say, what do you think? And this is the 5th time I've seen somebody do this. It's not going to work. Or, wow, this is an actually new, interesting space. The way they're doing it, I would love to have a meeting. That's what I really love about corporate venture capital. The problem is, depending on the size of your company, some of those discussions take a long time. There's often cultural challenges that need to be overcome in a global company. And so it doesn't necessarily execute as well as you always hope.
I talked to a number of people who were in corporate VC and moved to financial VC. Basically, their conclusion is, I lost my superpower. I had the mothership superpower, this expertise, and now I don't have them anymore.
Yes. Yeah, it's wonderful. I love having kind of like a big consulting firm in your pocket, because you can actually just say, I need to learn about X or Y. and you're able to just be able to take that in. And they probably have 15 decks that they've already built around it, and you can take them for lunch and you can figure it all out. So it's a really wonderful superpower to have. I like how that's been described.
Actually, I think it's better than a consulting firm because they actually are the real experts doing the real work, not just advising.
Yes, but they've synthesized it all for you. So they've summarized it all into their deck. And so I don't need to know the details. I just need to know the key levers and the outcomes that I can then help support.
I think you had a second point.
Yeah, that was the two, is just, having those experts in the field. The pro and con to both of it is that it's a great tool to access, but sometimes it is challenging with timelines.
Oh, very nice. So you have mentioned follow investments and staying with portfolio companies. Maybe you could share your philosophy about follow investments. When would you consider doing follow? When would you not?
So follow-on investments is an important tool for a fund because often seed funds either can't follow on or can't follow on meaningfully. And so you really have to get that bang for your buck in your first check, not only for the economics, but to set the tone of the relationship. Because if a founder knows that you can't continue to support them financially, they're still going to want your input, et cetera. But in reality, they really need to focus on funding their company, and cash flow is important. And so they're going to have to take time away from their relationship with you to cultivate relationships with whoever's going to fund the next round. And so if you're able to fund their next round, it gives a little more time to build a stronger relationship and to be able to put clear milestones in place to say, this is how I'm going to make my next decision and how I'm going to be able to decide if I write a second check. And that second check is really hard to make that decision because you're emotionally invested in this company and you know a lot more. And it's very difficult to tell a company that you're not going to fund them, and that might end up shutting down their company or having a material adverse effect on the company. And so that's really hard to do. So you really have to, from the onset, set that clear criteria as to how you're going to judge whether you make a follow-on investment. And then you have to decide how much you're willing to deviate from that. It's like buying a house, right? You're going shopping, here's my limit, and then you love the house so much, and it's $100,000 more than you want to pay. Do you still pay it? So what's the criteria? So it's really important to bring in other team members to help with that decision at the seed stage.
There's so much golden nuggets in this response. I like how you described it, which is setting the tone for the relationship, the first check, the size of the check, but also being so clear on expectations about why you would or you wouldn't do a follow next. And you're right, especially for an early stage company, that follow investment is a very strong signal to other investors, especially for VCs who actually may be able to follow. If you're a VC that never does follow, there is no signal. CDK Ventures launched a multi-LP fund called Fund EX1 for energy transformation. And this one is geo-focused to North America and Europe, where we believe there are a lot of tailwinds, which you kind of described. How do you see Europe in clean tech 5 years from now, knowing how they start to be really sensitive to their energy dependency?
Yes. So as background, I actually lived in Copenhagen for 2 years. And I say the average person in a coffee shop in Copenhagen is very savvy when it comes to climate tech and the sustainable development goals. I joke, you can go into any cafe and 70% of the people in there will tell you what those 17 SDGs are and how it aligns. And so I definitely am very positive about climate tech in Europe for 3 reasons. One is the big pension funds are demanding it. So they're demanding diversity, they're demanding ESG, and it trickles down into all the investments that flow under them. So the big institutional money is demanding that this happen. So it's coming, it's not going away. The second one is customer demand. And so the average customer, like all of the wonderful people in Copenhagen, they're demanding it. They're demanding that their energy be sourced from renewables. They're demanding that their car be electric. They're demanding that they have the infrastructure to charge those cars. And so the market has an opportunity there that the private sector is more willing to take up. And then lastly, like I said, regulation in particular. So all 3 of those things together are really driving a more stable demand. And so companies are more willing to go and deploy solutions. And then as an investor, when I know there's that stability there, it makes it, I would say, a more compelling investment case when I can have more confidence in their financial forecast as an example, because I know that those are the key factors driving the market.
So you just mentioned pension funds demanding diversity and ESG, and you have worked in women in VC. Can you share improvements in diversity or lack of in venture capital, but also the value of diversity of thoughts for venture capital?
So definitely believe in having diverse teams, and gender diversity is the most obvious, but it's also about ethnic diversity and diversity of education and experiences. I always use this example of my husband, who's an artist and designer, and I go home and I talk about all of these cool things that I'm working on, and he gives me this perspective, and I say, oh, thanks, but you don't understand my industry. Let's talk about something else now. And then 3 days later, after it's kind of settled, what? That was a really great idea. I'm going to steal that idea and I'm going to talk about it now. And so just having people that think differently, he doesn't have a spreadsheet for anything. I have inbox zero. He has 20,000 emails in his inbox. And so if you have those type of people on your team, you actually all think differently. It's very valuable. So it's really important to have that. And just generally, from a women in tech perspective, there are not enough women in tech. And Melinda Gates had a great article that was put out yesterday about how she's going to actually invest in more fund of funds and use different assessment criteria, not because the funds won't do as well. It's just because there haven't been as many women to build the track records or to have the personal wealth that typically comes with the system and the checklist that you have to use now. And so how do you change the checklist to be more inclusive, yet still provide the same amount of financial return? We're not doing the best job in having women in tech at the leadership level. It's coming, but I think we all have to do our part to just make sure that we're thinking differently when we hire and making sure that we have inclusive environments so everybody feels comfortable once we have our teams together to make sure that we're being able to take advantage of these superpowers.
I love it. Now let's talk about hiring within that context. Do you have any best practices in terms of hiring?
Yes. So number one, ask every single person on your team to share it with their networks, because different people have different networks. So if you only share it to your university alumni or your maybe quite homogenous circle, you're never going to get new types of applicants. The second one is, I actually got this idea from one of my startups that I invested in years ago. They said for every man, they interviewed a woman. And so the reason that they did that is, A, women tend to undersell ourselves on paper. And so when we came into the meeting, it actually maybe became more obvious that they were a better fit than might have looked on paper. The other thing is to have blind kind of first assessments. So taking off school, taking off name and gender to make sure that there's no unconscious bias. And then lastly, making a short list and making sure at least 50% of the short list is diverse. So there's a greater chance you'll hire a diverse person.
I'll add one more because I think it links to this one man, one woman. All our job descriptions go through a tool called Gender Decoder to make sure that we don't have words that filters out good candidates because they don't resonate with them.
I've actually gotten feedback from a lot of women in the tech sector on that. I need a tech ninja. That was the biggest one for a while, saying you needed somebody that was agile on the software side. And a lot of women just, I would never apply to something that had that description.
Exactly. I really like it. Let's talk about woven capital and maybe thinking about the audience as the entrepreneurs now.
Mm-hmm.
When should they approach you? How early should they approach you? What type of topics are you excited about this year, next year?
Great. Different people on my team feel differently, and I'm sure you have this on your team as well. Because I'm this person that knows a little bit about a lot of things, so that I can go talk to all of my superpower kind of bench that I have within the Toyota business units. I actually like to talk to companies earlier. And I really want to know how they're approaching it. What are they thinking about? So I can get a better understanding. I find like all that knowledge comes into play when I'm meeting with the business units. I know what's on the ground, because this is the one thing that CVCs have that nobody else in our company has, is we know what the market is doing in real time, because startups are talking to customers, they're talking to people that have this real problem right now. And so we are able to get that intel that I would say an engineer working on a project internally around electrification or hydrogen or factory, they don't have that network. And so I feel like that's an important thing to do, to be able to get all of that knowledge and really know what's going on. With the, as I said earlier, with the caveat to the company, this is our investment process. This is where you kind of are in it. And we can't participate in this round to make sure that expectations are managed. And so I think that's something I really like. Other people on my team and other funds I've worked at take a different approach, which is equally as valuable, where they want to stay much more focused on something that is really important as a priority area. And they tend to want to only talk to companies that are close to the investment period because they really want to make sure that they're doubling down and executing against a very clear milestone. And so I don't think either is wrong or right. It's just a different process. And for the most part, I am from a small town. I'm very social. I just love to know what's going on. I think it really gives me a lot of energy to see how they're doing that.
That's very nice. And what are you excited about in terms of topics, sectors you're interested to invest?
So how we work at our fund is every quarter we pick priorities, because as a global OEM, there are so many different topics that we could cover. And sure, we're still opportunistic as deals come through the door, but for the most part, we're really trying to focus each quarter. And the two areas that I put my hand up for this quarter were hydrogen and virtual power plants and vehicle to X or vehicle to grid. And number one, hydrogen is really important component of kind of zero emissions globally, and really trying to understand what role our company can play in that, and just what's going on and how it's being deployed and what the state of the market is. And then the second one is this virtual power plant and vehicle to X. And so if we have millions of these EVs driving around as little batteries, how do we make sure that we can use that to forego these large grid upgrades that need to happen? And so it's really just about optimizing this ecosystem. And so those are the two things all of my meetings, for the most part, are really focused on this quarter.
Thank you, Nicole, for your time. There was a lot of golden nuggets. I really appreciate.
Thank you. No, it was wonderful to talk.